Welcome to Sinful's Horror Stories. If you're new to the channel, please be sure to subscribe now for quality horror narrations on YouTube. Please make sure to hit the thumbs up button. Make sure to hit the bell so you're notified of all my new weekly uploads. The more likes this video gets, the more YouTube will recommend it to other people, so please be sure to like this video. Comment below and introduce yourself, and I will be sure to respond. If you want to be featured on an upcoming video, email me. My email will be in the description box below. Sit back, relax, enjoy this video. Stay sinful. When I was 17, I worked at a growing retail chain called Five Below, which, as you could probably guess, only sold items that were $5 or less. It was in a small outdoor shopping mall in my town, and was only about a 20-minute walk from where I lived. I was often given the night shifts, working from at least 4 to 10:30 at night, and when we'd let out at the end of our shifts, I'd often find myself walking home. This usually wasn't too much of an issue, as I had to walk along the side of a fairly busy street. It connected right onto a Route 1, so there was always cars passing by no matter how late at night. Given that I was a petite girl and often mistaken for being younger than I am, it gave me a bit of comfort knowing that there was always a possible witness in case some late-night creeper decided to try something. However, the encounters I had were far more unnerving due to how innocent the man seemed at first. There was a bus stop right at the corner of the street, the one I'd have to turn on to take a quieter street. Sometimes there would be people sitting there, waiting for the bus of the evening, and sometimes a homeless man would use the bench as his bed for the night. He looked to be in his late 60s, had matted white hair, and only had an old torn blanket to keep him warm. He left his hat on the ground beside the bench, in case anyone with change would drop some in while walking past. I did feel quite bad for the guy, as I'd been in homeless situations before myself, but there wasn't much I could do besides drop in some change every once in a while. He'd usually be asleep when I'd pass by him, and if I had money, I'd drop it in. One night as I passed, he turned suddenly, facing me, and his gray eyes seemed to just look right through me. "Spare change." His voice croaked quietly, and his eyes shifted to the empty hat by the bench. I began searching my pockets but found that I had nothing to offer. I awkwardly rubbed the back of my neck and shook my head. "No, I'm sorry, I don't have any." His eyes narrowed at me and I could sense great malice behind the stare. It was so intense that it made me freeze momentarily. He snatched the hat off the ground and placed it back onto his head, grumbling angrily. He then sat up and pointed a finger at me. "Not everyone is as lucky as you, girlie." He spat and seemed to be getting himself more and more upset. My nostrils flared up and I picked up the strong scent of alcohol, but I couldn't spot a beer bottle anywhere. I guess he had used the money people gave him earlier in the evening to drink at the bar down the street. I felt really uncomfortable and just wanted to get far away from him, so I waved to him apologetically and wished him a good night. He mumbled something in response, but I couldn't make out what it was, and as I turned onto the more secluded street, I decided I was no longer going to walk on this side of the street, at least not at the dead of night. I didn't see him again for a few days after that, and when he was there, he'd watch intently as I crossed the street. His eyes would follow me the entire time, until I disappeared around the corner. Things took a turn for the worse one of my last weeks working there. I was walking home one night to find that there was construction on the side I usually took, which meant I'd have to walk right past the bus stop, and of course the old man was seated there, downing a bottle of what looked like whiskey. As my form became more visible from the lights surrounding the bus stop, he smiled, a creepy, off-putting smile. I could already feel that gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Aren't you a pretty little thing?" he slurred, as it seemed he may not have registered that we interacted before. He scooted closer on the bench and I could smell the alcohol stronger now. He had to have been drinking at the bar again, and someone must have given him a bottle to go. I really couldn't be sure. In his drunken haze, he points at the familiar hat on the ground, and I already knew what he wanted. Luckily, I had about $2 in cash in my pocket. I pulled it out and threw it in, smiling awkwardly. He didn't bother looking down, and that smile he had on his face only seemed to widen. It was almost predatory, as though I was a fresh piece of meat on display at the grocery store. The feeling in the pit of my stomach told me to keep walking, and I wasn't going to ignore it. I wished him a good night and went on my way, and I felt his gaze follow as I turned the corner and onto the next street. This would have been the time where I would plug my earbuds into my ears and drown out the world on the rest of my walk home, but as I reached into my pocket, I realized I had left them at work. I was annoyed at the time, but it really was a blessing in disguise. I trudged on down the street, admiring the many leaves that scattered the ground. I was pulled from admiring the colors by a loud clinking sound. It sounded like metal hitting the pavement. I peeked over my shoulder immediately, but saw nothing. I was the only one walking. I assumed something fell into someone's driveway. I looked ahead and continued walking, this time a bit faster due to being spooked. As I got maybe another 15 or so feet, I heard another clink, except this time it was louder and closer than before. I paused and turned around swiftly, feeling that familiar feeling knot up in my stomach. There was no one on the sidewalk, no one in the driveways that I could see. My eyes began searching about, and I was becoming more and more paranoid. As I was about to give up and turn back around, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Across the street, crouched behind a parked car, was the old man from the bus stop. His gray eyes peeked at me over the left side of the trunk, watching intently. My eyes instantly widened in horror, letting out a scream and beginning to sprint as fast as my legs would permit. I could hear loud footsteps following close behind, and I was too overcome by fear to scream again. I turned the corner onto the next street, hearing the old man scream after me. His words were slurred, and I couldn't make out what he was saying, but his voice was getting closer to me, which meant he was closing the gap between us quickly. I was starting to lose stamina and realized I might not be able to outrun him. The fear of what he was planning on doing with me brought me to tears. As I felt myself slowing down, I prayed, but wasn't sure if that would even work. I'm not a religious person by any means, but it felt like the only thing to do. And then, as though it were some kind of miracle, a car turned onto the street and began making its way down, lighting up the street beside me and behind me. The homeless man was caught dead in the headlights, stopped almost immediately. In the corner of my eyes, I saw that in his left hand, he was holding an old Swiss Army knife. The person driving must have caught on to what was going on and began beeping their horn at him, which seemed to have freaked him out. He began taking off in the opposite direction, disappearing into the dark. I took that opportunity to run across the street and all the way home, being sure to lock the door behind me once inside. Everyone was asleep in the house, and I tried to remain quiet and not wake them, but I couldn't help but eventually breaking down, letting the whole realization of the situation crash into me all at once. I was really lucky to have gotten away from him, and I had no idea what the hell he was planning on doing. I barely slept that night and told my family what had happened in the morning. My brother believed the man wanted to rob me, despite the fact I had no money on me, except the $2 I gave him. But something about that smile on his face gave me a whole different idea of what he may have wanted. I didn't see the man after that night. I assumed he picked a new bus stop to sleep at since the incident. I also no longer walked home alone either. I always had a coworker drive me home or walk with me, but I'll never forget that night. Never walk home alone. You never know who may want to join you. This actually happened to a friend of mine. She used to live in an entirely different town when she was younger, and her closet had this strange door in the back of it. Well, whether it was imagined just due to her being a child at the time, or if it really did happen, she started to hear noises coming from behind the door whenever she went to bed. She told me that several times she tried telling her parents that she was hearing these noises, but they never believed her. So some time goes by, and one day her parents get a call from the police because they just arrested a homeless man. This was not just any homeless man though. This homeless man was living in some sort of tunnel that goes straight to that door in the back of her closet. So every once in a while, for whatever reason, this man would come through that door and watch my friend sleep in her closet. My friend was visiting family in the States. They lived in a rural community of Maine, and one morning she woke up before everyone else and decided to go for a run. After 30 minutes, she turned back and started noticing a van following a few blocks behind her. She thought it was strange, so started turning down a few streets with the van following her every move. She started sprinting and the van sped up to match her speed. She ran to the first house she could find and started banging on the door. No answer. She hopped the fence and started banging on the back door of the same home. The dog in the house started barking at her, but no one answered. She jumped into the empty pool in the backyard and hid while dialing 911. A car parked in the front of her house, and a man started calling out to her, offering her a ride home. The dog in the house was now barking like crazy, and the man left after about a minute. Police showed up and took her back to her family's place. She gave a report and they identified the van from a nearby HVAC business. It had been stolen earlier that day. This couple had a huge tree in their backyard, and it started to smell and ooze. They had arborists come in and look at the tree, but no one could figure out what was wrong. The couple decided to have the tree removed one day. When the branches started coming down, a body fell out. A homeless woman was sleeping in the tree and had died. Her body had been decomposing for ages. My friend came home from school one day to find that her house had been broken into. She decided to go inside and look around while she called her mom. She was done looking at the second floor when she made her way to the stairs. Her mom convinced her to go outside and wait for the police, who she had called. Later on, the police asked the family if they owned a crowbar. They said they didn't. They then said it looks like the offender was still in the house when she got home, and that they were waiting at the top of the stairs with the crowbar. My ex-wife and I woke up in the middle of the night to find all of our lights out in the house. We had not lost power. The living room light that we always leave on overnight had been turned off. The bathroom nightlight was removed and placed under the sink. The computer had been unplugged and the monitor cord was unplugged and neatly folded on the desk. All of the doors and windows in the house were unlocked, undamaged and standing wide open. Our bedroom door was open and the TV we always fall asleep to was turned off. Nothing was taken. Our cats were both hiding behind the refrigerator and stayed there for most of the day. Whenever someone came and knocked at the door, our larger cat would start to growl and stare at the door from then on. She no longer does this after we moved. I had awesome parents who let me sleep in the living room on weekends when I was very young, because my sister was a light sleeper and I could stay up until dawn. But of course I always ended up sleeping on the couch because Nick at Night made me tired. So one night I wake up to this prickly feeling, like an instinct. Just bolted into a sitting position and stared out the front window. We lived in rural Georgia, so you can imagine the magnitude of the trees. In the perfect light cast from the moon, I see a silhouette of someone in the fucking tree. The family dog dashes to the window and is snarling into the glass. Terrified, I run into my parents' room and try to explain to my parents that there was a strange person outside. Dad grabs something for defense and darts outside with the dogs to beat the wax off the hot head. I tremble in my mom's arms until Dad comes home and says he saw no one and to go to bed. I decided to sleep in my regular bedroom. I fill in my sister in as to what happened. Dad is making regular rounds in the house with a cup of coffee. We are all still, and I finally think I can sleep. Nope. I notice the man outside my window. From what I can see in the moonlight, he gives me a shush signal and runs away. Just turns around to run a straight line away. I swear I couldn't stop crying for what felt like hours. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the story selection tonight. Email your true scary stories to thesinfulsavant@gmail.com. The link to my email is in the description box below as well. Be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't. And I want to say a special thank you to my true loyal followers that actually finished the entire video. This one's for you. Till we meet again, stay sinful.
So I could give you a million times as a kid or as a young adult that I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, don't get me wrong, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost, not literally, out there by myself or with friends. As kids, we never got too far out there, but you could actually see the progression of us venturing further and further out as we got older because of forts and carvings that we would leave. And this one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We decided to try and find a new place to set up camp, and walked for what felt like a few miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us. We got the camp set up and fire going, and the plan was to just wait until nightfall, do a bit of smoking, and play some Monopoly. For the sake of backstory on my friend and I, my buddy is a smaller, real goofy guy, but comes from a family of foresters and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants that you come across here. He had no fear of going and camping out by himself, too. If I spent like 10,000 hours in the woods, he must have spent like 50,000. As for me, I'm taller, a bit sturdier, and as we got older, I spent more time worried about women and sports, and the woods became a place for small parties. Also, I never had the balls to really camp out alone, so I never really did it. In fact, older me wouldn't really go far at all when I was alone, because I could never shake the feeling of being watched out there. Which I know was just paranoia, but still, it's an uneasy feeling. Anyways, camp is set, fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs some wood. Sun is down and we're both cutting up and having a good time. My friend is sitting on his little chair that he always brought and loading up, and I was crouched breaking some excess limbs off of some of the logs that we'd gathered for the fire. When all of a sudden this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I sort of both stopped immediately and looked at each other. The breeze went just long enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness. Neither of us said a word. When, across from us, on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running and would slow down to a walk and then run again, definitely on two legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing sort of back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped with a softer crunch on the underbrush. I knew by the sound of it that whatever this thing was, it had taken a crouch. I was crouched still and knew that I was staring right at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy," and when he did that, I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel it and hear it in him as well. I'd been so fixed on the footsteps and rationalizing what I'd heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid yet. But this was true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend after a while grab some leaves and he dropped them on the fire. But for the split second the leaves covered the fire, we were in pure darkness too. But then the fire sprang to life. We both quickly grabbed some more leaves and brush and threw it on the fire as quickly as we could. I got some sticks and logs on there, and neither of us took our eyes off the spot or moved much for like over an hour, I think. Finally, the leaves crunched and whatever it was, it slowly walked off. Which means that whatever was there, it had sat there, crouched, watching us without moving for far longer than any animal I know would have. It wasn't until after the footsteps disappeared too that I realized the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill of all things. Spoiled eggs almost. For the rest of the night, besides whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped looking at that spot. We didn't go into the tent, and I had a very short, light sleep sitting on the ground with my head rested on my hands. But my friend never went to sleep, and in the morning, we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day, too, we talk about it often. In the 7 to 8 years since it happened, my forester friend has not camped by himself out there since. And to be honest, I don't blame him. So this was my experience with the big killer clown panic of 2016. I think about it all the time and wonder what would have happened if I reacted differently and wasn't on my guard. So I, 6'2" male, was 16. I just bought my own car for like $1,000 from a buddy and took any chance that I had to drive it literally anywhere. So one weekend, I have a couple of days off work in a row. I decide I'm going to go drive an hour to the small town that I used to live in and see some of my old friends that still live in there. It's about maybe 6 p.m. by the time that I get into town, and I start calling some of my friends. No one's really answering yet, so I go to my grandparents' house and I say hi to them and just kill some time. Well, I'm there for a while and not a single one of my friends is free tonight. I'm kind of bummed out. My family is just talking about how everyone is freaking out about the killer clown sightings and whether it's real or not, and I'm over it, so I just decide to leave. Now it's about 8 p.m, just starting to get dark, and I stop at the only liquor or convenience store in town to get some cigarettes. I looked older than I was and never got carded in this tiny town. Except the door is locked, and I don't see anyone or many lights when I peek in the door. That sucks, but whatever. I don't need cigs anyway. I do think it's a bit weird though, as I've never seen that store closed like once in my whole life. As I'm walking back to my car though, I notice that it's weirdly quiet, even for this town. It was kind of foggy that night, so I can't see too far ahead of me, and of course I have killer clowns on the brain, so I get a little bit spooked. Then, what seemed like out of nowhere, I see a woman come into view near where the road meets the liquor store lot. She's walking towards my car, the only car in sight, and shouts to me. I can't tell what she's saying at first, but she gets closer and I make out bits and pieces. Apparently, she's petrified by the rumors of killer clowns. She tells me that 2 kids were just murdered down the street at the high school by one of them, literally half a mile from us. Obviously, I don't really believe her, but I keep listening. She asks first if I can give her a ride to her house. Instantly, I say no way. I know this town really loves drugs of all kinds, and I just don't trust it. She keeps asking, though, and won't leave me, so I say, how about this? I'll drive on the shoulder behind or next to you as you walk home, so if anything happens, I'll be there in my car. She says fine, and we start going. She's going super slow, though. I have my hazards on, driving half on the shoulder down the country road as she walks beside my open passenger side window. A couple of times she says something like, "Come on, can I just get in? I'm super scared." And I tell her that there are no killer clowns, there's no need to be scared, and I'm not going to risk my safety, and she shuts up. After maybe 10 minutes, we turn down a dirt road that ends at a clearing, and I stop the car. She says, "Okay, I see my house from here," and I say, "Cool, see you later." But then she freaks out and says, "No, you have to walk me to my house." She points to a big old farmhouse about 150 feet in front of us through the clearing. I say, "No, I'm done. I told you that I'd help you get home, but we're here. We can see your home right in front of us, and it just feels off." At this point, she gets super weird, starts sort of rubbing her body up and down as if to be sort of sexy, and keeps asking please, and implies that she'll do something for me I want in exchange. I put it in reverse at this point, start backing up, and she literally puts her arms in and ducks her head into my driver's window and sort of demands that I give her any money that I have. I don't really have any, so I just sort of shove some change from the pocket in my door into her hand, and I peel out of there. As I'm backing up to the main road, though, the whole time she's just staring at me, not walking toward her house. I drove an hour home and have been thinking about it since. I've always felt like if I walked up to her home that night, that there would have been more people waiting to do, well, whatever they wanted to do with me. Thankfully, I feel like I made a whole lot of right choices that night, and I made it out with just a spooky story. So, I've always been kind of creeped out by the house that me and my mum have lived in, but it's gotten a little out of hand lately, I think. I always got that kind of feeling like, oh, someone's in the room with me right now, or someone is looking at me, and I would always check around to find nobody there, though. There are some pages posted around the halls. We rent an apartment in a house owned by someone else, with a bunch of writing on it that I and my mum could never figure out, and that added to the creepiness, I suppose. Either way, though, my room has 2 windows, so there's lots of natural light. I used to have sheer curtains and pretty much keep them open constantly, until my parents came home one day and said that they saw someone outside of my window watching me. It was dark out. I'll tell you that story if anyone wants to hear it, but the neighbors here are terrible and always are messing with us, so I always just assumed that it was them being creepy, but now I'm not so sure. I hate being alone here, though, even though I'm a huge introvert and alone time is awesome. I just always hear noises, though, that I can never figure out where they're coming from. There's always scratching in the walls, even though we've checked many times and there's no evidence of vermin. And recently, things keep falling around the house, too. I thought that maybe it was paranormal, but I'm even more scared that it's actually a real person. It just happened again, and that's what triggered me to share this, because currently I'm home alone, and I kept hearing noises around the house. As usual, I kept my door open, lights on in the main house, and cat on my bed. I kept getting up to check on what the noises were, in case of an intruder or anything, right? But there's nothing like normal. But then, I hear a really loud crash from the bathroom, another side of the house. I took a curtain rod for safety, a real useful right, and went to investigate, and I didn't see anything suspicious. That is, until I looked up. You see, we have a drop tile ceiling, or whatever it's called, just in the bathroom for some reason. Nowhere else in the house, which is weird, but it's like those school ceilings. and one of the tiles was completely pulled out of place. I used my handy curtain rod to push it back into place, got my cat, he ran off to investigate the loud bathroom crash too, and a knife for security. I've already texted my mum. I don't want to say anything out loud, because if it is really a person, then they might hear me. But it's not really possible for those tiles to support someone's body weight, but something definitely moved it out of place, and there was some loud noise that happened along with it. I don't know what the explanation could even be. Couldn't be the neighbours, there are floorboards between their floor and our ceiling. Unless they have some sort of a creepy crawl space to our apartment. Plus, I can hear them upstairs right now. They're stomping around and screaming at each other like usual. Whatever it is, I don't want to even know about it, but I think that I'm probably going to find out pretty soon. When I was a kid, about 12 to 13 years old or so, I wasn't in the best home situation, which meant that I spent a lot of time running away from home, hiding in my room, or walking the streets at night. My home, outside of the terror of my parent, wasn't the safest either. It was a 3-bedroom ranch, no larger than like 900 square feet, with front and side doors that no longer locked correctly. Even with the deadbolt, one good push and it would swing open. My brother and I, we often slept in the living room with a baseball bat, just in case someone tried to come in. And one night, while sleeping in the living room, our side door began to shake violently. At first I thought it was our parent coming in from the garage, and I did my best to pretend to be asleep. Unlike my parent, who would have pushed the door open by now, the door was still closed despite the shaking. I tried to wake up my brother, but he wouldn't get up, so I ended up grabbing the bat and walked to the door myself. Since it was one of those kitchen doors with the window, I left the lights off and crouched to avoid being seen. I could see the gold doorknob being jerked back and pushed forward rapidly. It was never turned though, so I relaxed. It was probably a friend from down the street messing with us, I thought. So I peeked through the curtain to see who held the knob, but quickly noticed that the screen door over the main door was still closed, which meant the doorknob was sealed behind its latch. No one should have been able to grab it without at least cracking the screen door open. When I looked past the screen door, I noticed that there wasn't anyone there too. In disbelief, I opened the curtain door and looked all around the door, which was still shaking from the knob. I decided that this had to be someone messing with us too at this point. I mean, it had to be, right? I didn't know how or why, but it must have been. So I grabbed the doorknob with my free hand, but released it almost just as quickly because it was freezing to the touch, as if someone had stuck it in the freezer or something. Well, fed up and annoyed now, I turned on the porch light and swung open the curtain, ready to catch them in the act. But to my horror, there wasn't anyone there. Like I had suspected, the screen door was closed all the way, and the frame and bottom covered up the doorknob. There was no one hiding by the car, on the other side of the house, or ducking on the porch, but the knob was still shaking. Lost for words and thoroughly terrified at this point, I just conceded and turned back towards the living room. I had to wake up my brother, and as I was rushing back to him, I suddenly just heard silence. There was nothing. The knob had stopped. I turned to look back, and in front of the door, inside of my kitchen, was a tall, pale man with dark, shaggy, wavy hair all of a sudden. Obviously, I was terrified. He must have been the one messing with the door, and now he was inside somehow because I failed to see him outside or something. I kept my eyes on him as I held up my bat and started yelling for my brother. The man didn't react though and took a couple of steps towards me. He seemed almost bored, if that's the right word. His hands were in his pants pockets and his shoulders were slouched slightly. My brother was finally starting to stir, and I was feeling like we were about to have the fight for our lives until the man tilted his head back, and it was just enough to clear some of his shaggy bangs from his face. And I can never forget this. Where his eyes should have been, there were like two rotting sunken pits. Well, at that, I screamed like I had never screamed before. My brother sprang up from the sofa all of a sudden and immediately rushed to me, wondering what was wrong. I closed my eyes and dropped to my knees, covering my ears as he tried to comfort me. I don't know why I reacted like this, instead of telling him that there was an intruder in the house and to grab the bat, but the fear I felt was just so overwhelming that I couldn't control myself. When I finally did manage to tell him, he looked for the man, but told me that we were alone. There was no man. The door was still closed, and he told me that the knob felt like it always did. This was not the only time that I would ever encounter something like this, but this was the first time, and I just wanted to share this. So, thanks for listening. This happened about a month ago, and it still comes up in conversation because we just genuinely don't know what happened or was about to happen to us. I'm sharing this story to hear your thoughts and ideas. So, it was around 7 p.m. in November. It was dark in Metro Detroit. I was driving and my fiancée was riding passenger. We were exiting a pretty popular highway when we turned onto a mile road near the city shopping mall and outlet centres. Being in close proximity to the mall, it was sort of strange the boulevard was that empty at that time of night. But we're driving on this deserted westbound side of the boulevard when we noticed that there was a stopped running vehicle in the middle lane. Again, it was dark aside from the streetlights that line the road every 80 yards or so, but their brake lights were obviously lit and we approached quickly. My fiancé and I were talking in the car at the time when we both kind of stopped to verbally question what we were both seeing. It was strange behaviour, especially since the speed limit is like 45 to 50 here on this mile road. In other words, you don't want to be stopped, especially this close to people exiting the highway. So we sort of slowed down since we're sort of cautious drivers. We approached and passed the vehicle in the far left lane as it was in the middle, and when we were about maybe a car length in front of it, the driver just gunned it and started speeding to catch up to us. We never left our left-hand lane, but at this point, I was braking because, again, the behaviour was really off and we noticed their driving was sporadic. Braking was almost instinctual as much as it probably wasn't safe to do so, but continuing to drive down this mile road, still no traffic in either direction that we could see, we noticed that the driver was swerving their car between the middle lane and the left lane as if trying to intentionally sideswipe us. It was an instant red flag, obviously, but it wasn't like the driver was intoxicated or texting and just doing a poor job to stay in their lane. This was a driver in control of their swerving and coming dangerously close to hitting the side of my Jeep, going like 45, which was obviously really dangerous. And before we knew it, we were blinded by a spotlight coming from the driver's window into my car via the passenger window. I have 20 tints on my Jeep windows, which usually helps control the brightness of the sun most mornings, and evenings too. But even with the tints, this spotlight stunned us, and we couldn't see anything but white. I didn't have time to check my mirrors before slamming on my brakes, not sure I would have been able to see in my mirrors after being blinded like that anyway. But I remember my fiancé screaming, "What the heck?" But we opened our eyes though, and the driver was yards ahead of us now, speeding to get away. I had my fiancé dial 911 immediately. I don't take this sort of rubbish though, so I started racing down the road to catch up to him for a license plate number. In Michigan, we have Michigan left turn lanes, and I could see the vehicle up ahead turning into one to enter the mall parking lot, which is a huge roundabout. The roundabout speed limit is maybe about 25, with frequent stop signs and intersections. My fiancé connected with dispatch on the phone as I was trying to desperately catch up to this vehicle. They were blowing every red light and stop sign in sight. The dispatch recommended that we don't follow, but I kind of did anyways because I was really upset at this point and committed to grabbing their plate number, but from a safe distance and at a safe speed, obviously. No way was I going to tail this person when we didn't even know if they had a weapon or something. But, long story short, this driver knew that we were following them and they were speeding through the roundabout, cutting drivers off and blowing intersections when eventually we lost sight of them. At this point, the police said the cops in the area were already on their way looking for this vehicle that we described and that we should leave it to them. We weren't going to jeopardize our safety and the safety of other drivers just because I was annoyed, so we stopped our chase but still crossed an intersection into another shopping center across the street that we saw the driver enter. But we figured that we could prowl instead of chase, just in case we saw them again. But, unfortunately, we never found that car again. We never found out who the driver was, what his motive was, or if the cops found him. But we knew that it was a male driver because we saw him through his driver's side window before he blinded us. It was a white male, dark ball cap. He drove a dark sedan, looked like a newer Ford Fusion, I think. But it was definitely a close run-in, and I'm not sure what would have happened if he had successfully crashed into us on that deserted mile road, or if his spotlight had successfully veered my car off the road. We don't think this was a case of road rage too, since we didn't do anything to provoke him. But whatever the case, I'm just glad that we got out of that situation safely.